Hello, and thank you for joining me. Today, I'd like to take the opportunity to talk about gender discrimination. We're going to take a look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This presentation will dive into the history and give you a deeper understanding of the law itself. As part of this company, we find it's important to not just bring awareness of gender discrimination to the workplace, but also have you feel confident in your knowledge of the law. With that said, let's take a look at what I've prepared for you today. Let's start by defining gender discrimination. Gender discrimination refers to the unequal treatment of someone based on their gender expression. It doesn't necessarily constitute sexual harassment, but rather a privilege or priority given to one person over another based solely on their gender. Gender discrimination can also be referred to as sexism. However, in recent years, there is information that has come out to suggest that gender exists more on a spectrum and may not be purely biological, such as male and female. So how does this impact employees? Studies have proven that a mental and physical toll is taken on an individual when experiencing gender discrimination in the workplace. All of this leads to a large decrease in productivity. Productivity in the workplace is one of the most important things. You'll notice on this slide that I did include some general statistics. Down in the bottom left corner, you'll also notice that I have included a URL that describes some of the studies that have been done on gender discrimination and how it impacts employees. So now I'm going to introduce you to the law that involves gender discrimination. We're going to take a look at Title VII. Title VII is part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It applies to employers with 15 or more employees, and it talks about discrimination based on many factors, including gender identity. It sets forth a standard for gender equality and also allows for equal access to employee benefits. There have been additions to this law over the years. An amendment was added to Title VII of Civil Rights Act in 1978 called the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. This was created to make sure that employers weren't discriminating against pregnant employees. They could not force the employee to resign or lay off the employee due to their pregnancy. They also could not demote them or refuse to hire a pregnant woman. Another amendment was added to the Title VII of Civil Rights Act in 2009 called the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. This actually removed the statute of limitations on litigation about equal pay. This means that a female who didn't initially know about the wage discrimination but later finds out about it can ask for restitution and back pay. All this paved the way for new legislation as well. An amendment was added to the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1963 called the Equal Pay Act. This protected against wage discrimination based on gender. And more recently, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which expanded upon the Pregnancy Discrimination Act and even included rules about how to accommodate for breastfeeding mothers. While I'd like you to keep gender discrimination at the forefront of your mind for this presentation, I do think it's important to take a deeper look at some general events in history that helped lead to the enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Rising unemployment during the Great Depression led Congress to pass the Unemployment Relief Act of 1933. The wording includes the statement, "In employing citizens for the purpose of this act, no discrimination shall be made on account of race, color, or creed." Unfortunately, there were no enforcement mechanisms in place for this act at the time, and so it wasn't very successful. Moving on, President Roosevelt eventually signed an executive order which established the Fair Employment Practice Committee. They had the powers to investigate complaints of discrimination and to take appropriate steps. This is noted as the first ever presidential action taken against employment discrimination by private employers. In March of 1961, John F. Kennedy signed an executive order that prohibited federal government contracts from discriminating on account of race and established the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity. In June of 1963, Congress passed the Equal Pay Act of 1963. This established a law against paying men and women differently for equal work in the same establishment. This was considered the first national civil rights legislation focused on employment discrimination. While we look back on the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King's efforts as an end to segregation, it also played a big part in gender equality. Kennedy actually called for the creation of a new civil rights bill that would establish equality in many different aspects before his assassination in November of 1963. It was the next year, on July 2nd, that the U.S. House of Representatives passed Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. President Lyndon B. Johnson actually went on to sign the bill into law that same evening. So, since we've discussed gender discrimination under Title VII and some of its federal counterparts, while also looking at the history behind the legislation, I'd like to take a second to talk about another act that was enacted, but on a state level. Michigan has the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act. It was signed into law in 1977, and what it did was expand on the forms of discrimination that are noted in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It included things such as height, weight, age, marital status, and family status. There were actually recent amendments. In 2023, Gretchen Whitmer signed new orders that increased the protections in the ELCRA. The amendment includes protecting employees who had an abortion from employment retaliation, and it also offers protection for sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. Now that we've learned what gender discrimination is and Title VII, let's quickly discuss who is tasked with enforcing this law. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was born out of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The commission itself consists of 5 members, with not more than 3 of them having a similar political affiliation. Each member is elected for a 5-year term by the current president and confirmed by the Senate. The EEOC is currently undergoing a reshaping, and we are actually going to talk about this later on in the presentation. So now that we know that the EEOC is tasked with enforcing the law, let's learn how they do so. There are many steps that the EEOC takes in enforcing companies to comply with the rules and regulations. The commission investigates complaints by gathering evidence from the employee and reaching out to the employer for more information. The commission then tries to work to resolve the complaints through mediation. They try to do this before instigating any legal action against the employer. However, if that doesn't work, legal action is the next step in the process. One of the best ways that the laws are enforced is actually by general education and outreach done to prevent the discrimination from arising in the first place. They do this by putting out publications, creating workshops, and by providing training programs to employees. So let's take a look at some of the most recent cases that the EEOC has brought against employers for gender discrimination. In 2023, Mechanical Design Systems, Inc. was ordered to pay a settlement to female employees after it was determined that there was a pay discrimination between male and female project managers. The females had more experience and seniority in the company and still were paid less than their male colleagues, and they were all completing the same work. It was also noted in the case that the females were often given more work than their male counterparts. This not only violated the Civil Rights Act, but also the Equal Pay Act. In addition to the settlement, the company was also ordered to take affirmative action steps to prevent pay discrimination in the future. The very next year, in 2024, a Walmart in Iowa had to pay a settlement due to sex discrimination. A female employee was overlooked for a promotion, and when she inquired as to the reason, It was stated that she had young children at home and the company didn't see her as a long-term employee. A quote was brought about from an earlier case from the US Supreme Court that talks about how assuming that women are mothers first and workers second is a gender stereotype and not permissible under the Civil Rights Act. Finally, we're going to take a look at Lacey's Place in Chicago. The company actually had to pay a settlement in a discrimination lawsuit in 2023. Female managers were paid less than their male counterparts, and it was brought up to the company. The female employee was actually fired in retaliation. Lacey's Place was also required to create a policy against gender-based pay discrimination and retaliation, conduct anti-discrimination training, and conduct a pay equity study of the current district managers. The company even had to post a notice to its website about the lawsuit. Hopefully this information thus far has given you some more awareness of the law and how it relates to gender discrimination. Now we can learn to apply that knowledge in our own work environment. As a company, we have a responsibility to not only comply to the rules and regulations, but also to foster an environment where gender inequality is discouraged to the point of non-existence. We can do this in multiple ways. It's important to make sure that employees are included in the discussion when creating company policies, and it's also important to include tools for employee feedback. Employee training is very important as well. The company needs to make people aware that there is no threshold for the amount of harassment or discrimination. We don't want employees simply waiting to report something until it gets unbearable. The company needs to know immediately and will do everything to ensure confidentiality. Additionally, as supervisors and managers, it is your job to take any complaint seriously and follow strict reporting procedures. I would suggest an open door policy for all levels of management. This will help build a culture of trust and inclusivity in your work environment. Additionally, an anonymous reporting method should be made available, and extra training should be provided for management to know how to properly handle each complaint. And finally, I would suggest training on unconscious biases. Sometimes gender discrimination can arise without even knowing, and inclusion training is a good way to learn the ins and outs of this. It helps employees better be able to notice and fix the problem. This is especially important in the hiring process, and blind recruitment has been proven successful, and it's also something that I highly suggest. I appreciate you staying with me and staying engaged in this presentation. For the last slide, we actually have to talk about the current political environment. I told you earlier we would touch base on the EEOC reshaping, and let's go ahead and dive into that. There are some suggestions in the last slide that I did not include due to the current standing of the law. By that I mean, President Trump has recently dismissed certain members of the EEOC, and the future of the committee is being re-examined. He has also signed executive orders that revoke certain equal opportunity employment initiatives. Also, the federal DEI programs are being shut down, and the nation is unsure of the path in which we were headed. The president has even signed executive orders that remove gender ideology from workplaces. I have included on the slide some cases from the EEOC that are being dismissed because of the new regulations. Discrimination against transgender or non-conforming workers is no longer protected under the law. So we'll note that it's important now more than ever for companies to find ways to engage in social responsibility for their employees. We need to keep Title VII in our mindset and engage in creating an inclusive work environment. Gender is a hotly debated topic right now, and it's important that we don't lose sight of the meaning of the Civil Rights Act and equality for all. No matter what side of the fence you sit on, I think we can all agree that discrimination is something that negatively impacts a work environment and the productivity of our staff. Thank you.